Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I want to compare three Boss OS-2 style pedals. So I've got the OG Boss Overdrive Distortion, the OS-2. I've got the Boss BE-5, which has an overdrive distortion section in it that looks very much like the OS-2. And I've got the Behringer clone, which is the Overdrive Distortion OD300. So I'll start with all the knobs at 12 o'clock and I'll just flick between the three pedals so you can hear what that does. Starting with the OS-2. That was interesting. I thought the BE-5 was the quietest of the three, and also it was slightly more muffled. The OS-2 and the OD300 sounded very close. What I'm going to try and do is match the tones between the OS-2 and each of these. Okay, so that is the BE-5 matched. So in order to do that, I've got it set slightly more to the distortion side. I've got a little more overdrive tone and level. Let's try it with the Behringer. Yeah, I think they match nearly identically. The OD300 is perhaps a little bit louder and maybe a tiny bit darker, but if you look at where the controls are set, the OD300 is much closer to the OS-2 than the BE-5 is. Let's try a setting with the color knob turned all the way to the left so that it's all overdrive, and we'll see how close they sound. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So again, the BE-5 version is a little bit darker sounding than the OG. I've got the tone turned up. Now that's not necessarily a problem, but it might mean that you won't be able to get a bright enough sound on the BE-5 if that's what you're looking for. Let's try the Behringer. Yeah, again there was a little difference there. I think the OD300 is a little darker sounding than the OS-2, but I was able to match the tone pretty well. So now I'll turn the color knobs all the way to the right to give us the distortion mode, and we will try that. Yeah, the OS2 in the BE-5 sounds a little washed out compared to the original. It does noticeably sound different, but it still sounds quite good. So let's go for the Behringer now. To me, they sounded identical, and I didn't even have to do any tweaking on the OD300. So what I'll do now is just try and set up a cool sound, not going for anything in particular, just what I think I might use in a track, and well, I'll compare the settings I end up with on all three. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting test. I was able to match the Behringer very well to the original OS2. The settings are a little different, but not so much. I believe I've set the gain a little higher and the tone a little higher, the level a little less. But it's nailed on. It sounds exactly the same. The BE-5 is definitely more disappointing than these two, but it still sounds pretty good. Now, what's important is not that we are trying to emulate exactly what the OS2 does. We want to make a cool distortion sound with the 303, and I think all of these units do that. You cannot argue with the affordability of the Behringer, and it sounds every bit as good as the Boss does. The BE-5 is the more expensive of the three, but as we know, it has a compressor, a delay, a noise suppressor, and a chorus in it. So it's not exactly a like-for-like comparison. I would say out of the three, clearly this one has a metal case. It's never going to break. I mean, people say about these Boss pedals that if there's a nuclear war in the kind of aftermath, they'll just be cockroaches rocking out with Boss pedals because they're impossible to break, and it definitely feels like that. The BE-5 is plastic. It feels cheaper. These knobs are definitely a lot more flimsy than the other three. But I think it is definitely a step in quality above the Behringer, which feels very flimsy. I mean, it would be totally fine for studio use. And I think it would even be fine at a gig if you were careful with it. I wouldn't use it like a guitarist does by throwing it on the floor and just standing on it with your Dr. Martens. But if you have it on a table and you treat it nicely, you won't have any problems gigging with that. So that was kind of an interesting comparison. I don't think there's a clear winner, but it's probably the Behringer, to be honest, just because it is so much cheaper than the other units. But these two have each got something going for it. This has all the other effects that it has. This is better built, and obviously it is the original. So have a think. Which one would you go for?